My sister called me her backup parent and banned me from dating because it would distract me from my responsibilities. My sister Laura had 3 kids in 4 years with a guy named Brett who took off when the youngest was 6 months old. I stepped up immediately because that's what family does. I was 25, working as a physical therapist, and had my own apartment 10 minutes from Laura's house. Every morning before work, I'd stop by to help get the kids ready for school and daycare. Every evening, I'd pick them up so Laura could work late at her accounting firm. Weekends, I'd take them to the park so she could clean or rest or just exist without someone needing something. I loved those kids like they were mine and honestly didn't mind helping. Laura and I had always been close, and seeing her struggle as a single mom broke my heart. For 2 years, this worked perfectly. The kids called me auntie and fought over who got to sit next to me at dinner. Laura would thank me constantly, saying she couldn't do it without me. We had a system, and it worked. Then Laura got promoted to senior accountant, and something in her brain shifted. She started calling me the backup parent. Not aunt, not helper, backup parent. She'd introduce me to people as her built-in childcare solution. When the school needed emergency contact info, she listed me as secondary guardian without asking. When the pediatrician asked about family medical history, Laura said to just put me down as the second parent since I was basically raising them anyway. I tried to laugh it off, but then the demands started getting weird. Laura informed me I needed to adjust my work schedule because the kids needed pickup at 2:30 now instead of 3. Just informed me. Like I didn't have a job with actual patients scheduled. When I said I couldn't change my entire calendar, she said backup parents make sacrifices. She started dropping them off at my apartment without warning. I'd come home to find 3 kids on my doorstep with a note saying Laura had an emergency meeting. The emergency was usually her getting drinks with coworkers. She gave the school my address as a secondary residence and told them the kids might be staying with me during the week sometimes. The principal called me confused about the custody arrangement. The real problem started when I met Tom at my gym. Sweet guy, worked as a firefighter, had this amazing smile. We went on a few dates and it was going really well. Laura found out when she went through my phone while I was playing with the kids. She lost it completely. Said I couldn't date because the kids needed stability and bringing random men around would confuse them. I hadn't even introduced Tom to the kids yet. Laura said that wasn't the point. The point was I needed to be available at all times, and dating would distract me from my responsibilities as backup parent. She actually said I'd made a commitment when I agreed to help, and dating would be breaking that commitment. She told the kids Auntie might not be around as much because she was choosing some man over them. My 6-year-old nephew cried, asking why I didn't love them anymore. That's when Laura printed out a schedule. A literal hour-by-hour schedule of when she needed me to watch the kids for the next 3 months. It included overnight stays, full weekends, and 2 weeks straight in summer, while she went on a work retreat that I later found out was optional. At the bottom, she'd written that I needed to sign it as acknowledgement of my duties as backup parent. She'd also written that I understood dating was not compatible with this role. I asked if she was serious, and she said single parents don't get to have social lives, so why should I? The backup parent comment finally made sense. She didn't see me as family helping out. She saw me as her co-parent who just happened to live separately. And co-parents don't date other people in her mind. I told her she was being insane, and she said if I didn't sign, she'd have to find alternative childcare, which the kids would hate, and it would be my fault for abandoning them. So I signed it. Then I started following it exactly. Every single line. Monday morning, I pulled up to Laura's house at exactly 6 a.m. like the schedule said. The sky was still dark, and the street was quiet except for one neighbor's porch light. I sat in my car for a minute looking at Laura's front door and the printed schedule on my passenger seat. The schedule said morning childcare duty starts at 6, so here I was. I grabbed my coffee mug and walked up to the door using the spare key Laura gave me 2 years ago when this whole thing started. The house was completely silent inside. No lights on, no sounds of anyone moving around. I checked my phone to make sure I had the time right. 6 a.m. Monday morning. That's what it said in Laura's neat handwriting. I walked into the living room and sat down on the couch. The kids didn't need to be up until 6:30 for school. Laura usually got them moving around 6:45. But the schedule didn't say 6:30, it said 6. So I sat there in the dark living room sipping my coffee and waiting. Around 6:15, I heard footsteps upstairs. Laura came down in her bathrobe looking confused and annoyed. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs when she saw me sitting there. I held up my coffee mug in greeting. She asked what I was doing here so early, and I pulled out the printed schedule and showed her the first line. Morning childcare duty begins at 6 a.m. Monday through Friday. She stared at the paper, then at me. She said the kids weren't even awake yet, and I nodded and said, I know, but the schedule says 6, so I'm here at 6. Laura rubbed her face and asked what I was supposed to do for the next half hour. I looked at the schedule again and told her it doesn't specify my duties for this time block, just that I need to be present starting at 6. She looked like she wanted to argue, but instead just went to the kitchen to make coffee. I stayed on the couch scrolling through my phone. At 6:30, I heard the kids starting to wake up upstairs, and I went up to help them get dressed like I always did. Laura stood in the kitchen doorway watching me with this weird expression I couldn't read. The whole morning routine felt off because we both knew I'd been sitting downstairs in the dark for 30 minutes just following her written rules. I got the kids breakfast and packed the 6-year-old's lunch. Laura didn't say anything else to me. At 7:15, I loaded the kids into my car to drop them at the school and daycare. As I was leaving, Laura called out asking what time I'd be back for pickup. I checked the schedule and told her 2 p.m. like it says here. She said school doesn't end until 3, and I said I know, but the schedule says 2, so I'll be there at 2. Her face went red, but she just closed the door. I drove the kids to the school and daycare, then headed to work. My first patient was at 8:30, and I made it with 10 minutes to spare. Tuesday, I showed up at Laura's house at 6 a.m. again. This time, she was already downstairs waiting for me, looking tired and annoyed. The rest of the week went the same way. Every morning, I arrived at 6, even though the kids didn't need me until 6:30. I'd sit on the couch or help make coffee or just exist in the house for that extra half hour. Laura stopped commenting on it, but I could feel her watching me. The afternoon pickups were worse. School let out at 3, but the schedule said 2 p.m. pickup, so I started leaving work at 1:30 to sit in the school parking lot. My supervisor, Julian, noticed me leaving early every day and asked if everything was okay. I rescheduled 3 patient appointments that first week to make the 2 p.m. time work. I'd sit in my car in the empty school parking lot reading or scrolling my phone while other parents slowly started arriving around 2:45. The school secretary came out Tuesday afternoon and knocked on my window asking if I was okay. I told her I was just early for pickup. She gave me a strange look and went back inside. Thursday afternoon, I was sitting in my car when Julian called and asked me to come by his office before I left for the day. My stomach dropped because I knew my weird schedule was affecting my work. I picked up the kids at 3 after sitting in the parking lot for an hour, then dropped them at Laura's house. The schedule said evening childcare from 5 to 8 p.m., so I had time to go back to the clinic. Julian was in his office when I got there at 4:15. He's been my supervisor for 3 years, and we've always had a good working relationship. He asked me to sit down and then said he'd noticed my schedule had become really chaotic lately. I'd been rescheduling patients, leaving early, seeming distracted during appointments. He asked if something was going on that he should know about. I pulled out Laura's printed schedule and handed it to him. He read through it slowly, and his expression changed from concerned to confused to something like anger. He looked up at me and asked if this was serious. I told him yes. My sister created this schedule and demanded I sign it, and now I'm following it exactly. Julian read through it again, paying attention to the times. He pointed at the 2 p.m. pickup and said school doesn't end until 3. I said I know. He asked why I was following a schedule that didn't make sense, and I explained the whole situation. How Laura had been treating me like a backup parent instead of family. How she'd tried to ban me from dating. How she'd given me this schedule with a note at the bottom saying I understood dating wasn't compatible with my role. Julian put the schedule down and told me this was exploitation. He said what Laura was doing had a name and it wasn't okay. I felt my throat get tight because hearing someone else say it made it real. Julian suggested I needed to have a serious conversation with Laura about boundaries and expectations. I told him I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. I wanted Laura to see exactly what she was demanding before I confronted her directly. If I followed her schedule precisely, maybe she'd realize how unreasonable it was. Julian looked skeptical but said he understood. He also said I needed to figure this out soon because it was affecting my job performance and patient care. I promised I'd handle it and left his office feeling worse than before. I drove back to Laura's house for evening childcare duty. The schedule said 5 to 8 p.m. I got there at 4:55, and Laura was still at work. The kids were with the neighbor who watched them for the hour gap between school and when I usually picked them up. I collected them from next door and brought them back to Laura's house. We did homework and I made them dinner. At exactly 8 p.m., I put on my jacket and told the kids I had to go. The 6-year-old asked why I was leaving, and I said, because my schedule says 8 p.m. is the end of evening duties. He asked where Mommy was, and I said I didn't know, but she'd be home soon. I texted Laura that I was leaving at 8 as scheduled. I got in my car and drove home. My phone rang before I even got out of Laura's neighborhood. It was Laura, and she was furious. She asked where I was, and I said I was heading home. She said the kids were alone, and I reminded her that I left at 8 p.m. exactly as the schedule specified. Laura started yelling that she wasn't home yet and I couldn't just leave the kids alone. I asked her what time the schedule said evening duties ended, and there was silence. Then she said 8 p.m., but obviously she expected me to stay until she got there. I told her the schedule doesn't say that. It just says 8 p.m. She called me petty and ridiculous. I asked her calmly if she wanted me to follow the schedule or not. More silence. Then she said through what sounded like gritted teeth that yes, I should follow the schedule. I said okay, then I'll see her tomorrow at 6 a.m. and hung up. Wednesday morning, I showed up at 6 a.m. and Laura looked exhausted. She'd clearly had to leave work early the night before to get home to the kids. She didn't say anything to me, just made coffee and got ready for work. The pattern continued through the week. Thursday, I left at 8 p.m. sharp again, even though Laura texted me at 7:45 saying she was running late. I texted back that the schedule says 8 p.m. She had to leave another work meeting early. By Friday, Laura was visibly stressed. She had bags under her eyes and kept checking her phone. I picked up the kids at 2 p.m. after sitting in the school parking lot for an hour. I brought them back to Laura's house at 5 for evening duties. At 7:30, Laura came home early looking defeated. She walked past me without saying anything and went straight upstairs. I stayed until 8 p.m., then left. My phone didn't ring this time. Saturday morning, I woke up in my own apartment with no schedule obligations and felt lighter than I had all week. Laura had the kids on the weekend according to her schedule. My phone rang at 9 a.m. and it was Tom asking if I wanted to grab breakfast. I said yes immediately. For the first time in a week, I felt like myself again. I got dressed and drove to the diner where Tom was already waiting in a booth by the window. He stood up and hugged me, and I realized how much I'd missed normal human interaction that wasn't dictated by a printed schedule. We ordered coffee and pancakes, and Tom asked how my week had been. I laughed, and it came out a little shaky. I told him about following Laura's schedule exactly, about showing up at 6 a.m. when the kids didn't wake until 6:30, about sitting in the school parking lots for an hour every afternoon, about leaving at exactly 8 p.m. even when Laura wasn't home yet. Tom listened without interrupting, and his face showed concern but not judgment. When I finished, he reached across the table and took my hand. He said it sounded like I was handling an impossible situation the only way that made sense. He didn't try to fix it or tell me what I should do differently. He just said he was sorry my sister was putting me through this, and he was here if I needed anything. We finished breakfast and walked around downtown for a while. Tom told me about a fire call his station had responded to earlier in the week. Normal conversation about normal life. I felt the tension in my shoulders start to ease. He asked if I wanted to catch a movie later, and I said yes. We spent the whole day together, and I didn't think about Laura's schedule once until my phone buzzed with a text from her, asking if I could take the kids tomorrow because she had plans. I showed Tom the message and he raised his eyebrows. I texted back that Sunday wasn't on the schedule. Laura responded with 3 angry face emojis. Tom said I was doing the right thing and I wanted to believe him. Sunday night, I checked my phone and saw 17 missed calls from Laura. The voicemail she left sounded panicked and angry at the same time, saying she needed to talk to me immediately about the schedule. I deleted it without calling back because Sunday wasn't on the schedule I signed. Monday morning, I showed up at 6 a.m. exactly as written and found a new copy of the schedule taped to Laura's front door. This one had handwritten notes scribbled in the margins with different colored pens. Next to the 6 a.m. start time, she'd written, "Obviously this means be ready to help when kids wake up, not just sit around." Next to the 2 p.m. pickup, she'd written, "Or earlier if I text you, use common sense." At the bottom, she'd added a whole paragraph about how the schedule was meant to be flexible, and I should interpret it with the kids' best interests in mind. I took a picture of it with my phone, peeled it off the door, and threw it in Laura's recycling bin. Then I knocked and waited. Laura opened the door looking surprised to see me standing there empty-handed. She asked where the new schedule was, and I told her I only signed one schedule and that's the only one I'm following. She started to argue, but I walked past her into the kitchen and poured myself coffee. The kids were still asleep upstairs, and Laura followed me asking why I was being so difficult about simple clarifications. I reminded her that the document I signed didn't say anything about clarifications or amendments. She'd demanded I sign a specific agreement, and now she was stuck with what she wrote. Laura's face went red, and she said I was being ridiculous and petty over semantics. I shrugged and sat down on her couch to wait until the kids actually needed me. By Tuesday, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the actual hours. Following the schedule exactly meant constantly checking the time, constantly enforcing boundaries, constantly saying no to Laura's attempts to modify our agreement. My coworker Kira noticed me staring at my phone during our lunch break and asked if everything was okay. I hadn't planned to tell anyone at work about the situation, but something about her genuine concern made the whole story come spilling out. I showed her Laura's printed schedule with all my notes and timestamps. I explained about the backup parent designation and the ban on dating and how I was following every line exactly to prove a point. Kira's face shifted from confused to concerned to horrified as I talked. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before saying that what Laura was doing had a name. She called it parentification and exploitation. She said her wife Harper was an elementary school teacher, and they'd learned about this pattern in families where one adult inappropriately burdens another adult or older child with parenting responsibilities. Kira said it was a form of manipulation and control that people often don't recognize because it's wrapped up in family obligation language. Hearing someone name what was happening made my chest feel tight. I'd been thinking I was overreacting or being selfish, but Kira was looking at me like Laura had done something genuinely wrong. Kira invited me to dinner at her place that Wednesday night to meet Harper and get another perspective. I almost said no because Wednesday was an evening duty night according to the schedule, but then I checked and saw that evening duties ended at 8 p.m. I could make a 9 p.m. dinner work. Harper opened the door with a warm smile and ushered me into their cozy house that smelled like garlic and tomatoes. Over pasta, Harper asked to see the famous schedule, and I pulled up the photo on my phone. She studied it carefully, zooming in on different sections, and her expression got more serious with each line she read. Harper said this was exactly the kind of red flag she watched for in her students' families, where one adult inappropriately burdened another and then made them feel guilty for setting boundaries. She pointed to the line about dating being incompatible with backup parent duties and said that was especially concerning because it showed Laura felt entitled to control my entire personal life. Harper asked how long this had been going on, and I realized with a sick feeling that the intense schedule was recent, but the pattern had been building for 2 years. Harper nodded like she'd expected that answer. She said Laura's behavior had probably escalated right after getting promoted, because sometimes people respond to increased responsibility by trying to control everything around them, instead of adjusting their own expectations. It was easier for Laura to control me than to admit she needed to hire actual help, or reduce her work hours, or accept that she couldn't do everything perfectly. The validation from Harper helped me feel less crazy, but it also made me angry in a way I hadn't let myself feel before. I'd been so focused on helping Laura and loving the kids that I hadn't stopped to question whether what she was asking was reasonable or fair. Harper said something else that stuck with me. She said the fact that Laura had put it all in writing and made me sign it suggested she knew on some level that her demands were excessive. Otherwise, why would she need a formal agreement? People don't make their family members sign contracts unless they're worried about pushback. That comment rattled around in my head the whole drive home. Laura had been worried I'd say no, so she'd manufactured a crisis with the kids' emotions and then presented the schedule as the only solution. I'd signed it because I felt trapped, but Laura had set the trap deliberately. Thursday morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Laura asking me to pick up the kids at noon instead of 2 p.m. because she had an important meeting. I stared at the message for a long moment before typing back that the schedule said 2 p.m. pickup, and that's when I'd be there. Laura responded immediately asking if I was seriously going to make her miss a crucial meeting over 2 hours. I replied that I had patients scheduled until 2 p.m. and couldn't change my work calendar. She sent back 3 angry emojis and then nothing else. I silenced my phone and went to see my first patient of the day. At noon, my phone started buzzing again, but I ignored it. At 1 p.m., Julian knocked on my treatment room door between patients and said I had an urgent call. I told him to take a message because I was with patients. He gave me a strange look but nodded and left. At 2 p.m., I checked my phone and saw 12 missed calls from Laura and 6 text messages getting progressively more frantic. The last one said she'd had to leave her meeting early and I'd made her look unprofessional in front of her entire team. I didn't respond. Wednesday of the following week, Laura showed up at my clinic during my lunch break. The receptionist looked uncomfortable as she led Laura back to the break room where I was eating a sandwich. Laura's face was flushed and her hands were shaking as she demanded to know why I was being so rigid and difficult when I knew she needed flexibility. She said the schedule was meant to be a framework, not a prison, and I was deliberately misinterpreting it to punish her. I finished chewing my bite of sandwich before responding. I told her calmly that this was exactly the schedule she'd created and demanded I sign. I was simply following our agreement to the letter, because that's what she'd asked me to do. If the schedule didn't work for her actual needs, then maybe she should reconsider what she was asking of me. Laura's voice got louder as she said I was being petty and vindictive, punishing her for setting reasonable boundaries about my dating life. Several of my coworkers had stopped what they were doing to watch our conversation through the break room window. I kept my voice level and quiet as I responded that I wasn't punishing anyone. I was just demonstrating that her expectations were impossible for both of us. The schedule she'd created didn't account for real life or flexibility, or the fact that I had my own job and responsibilities. She'd tried to make me sign away my autonomy, and now she was discovering that the control she wanted wasn't actually workable. Laura opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. Her face crumpled, and for a second I thought she might cry, but instead she turned and walked quickly out of the break room. Through the window, I watched her push past the receptionist and leave the building. Julian appeared in the doorway a moment later, looking concerned. He asked if I was okay, and I nodded even though my hands were shaking. Julian sat down across from me and said gently that we needed to talk about what was happening. He said my family situation was affecting my professional reputation and patient care. 3 patients had mentioned that I seemed distracted lately, and I'd had to reschedule multiple appointments to accommodate Laura's schedule demands. Julian said he understood family obligations, but I needed to protect my job because Laura's behavior was creating problems that extended beyond our personal relationship. I promised him I was handling it and the situation would resolve soon. Julian didn't look convinced, but he nodded and left me alone to finish my lunch. I couldn't eat the rest of my sandwich. That evening, I sat down at my kitchen table with Laura's printed schedule and a calculator. I went through line by line and added up the actual hours she was demanding. Morning duties from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. was 2 hours daily. Afternoon pickup and care from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. was 3 hours daily. Evening duties from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. was 3 more hours. That was 8 hours every single weekday. Then weekend duties were listed as Saturday 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. and Sunday 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. That was 9 hours on Saturday and 6 hours on Sunday. 8 hours times 5 weekdays was 40 hours. Plus 15 weekend hours made 55 hours total. I stared at the number in disbelief. Laura was demanding 55 hours per week on top of my 40-hour work week. I'd been working 95-hour weeks for 2 years without fully realizing it, because it had built up gradually. No wonder I was exhausted. No wonder I had no social life. No wonder the idea of dating had seemed impossible. I'd been working more than 2 full-time jobs, and Laura had responded to my attempt at boundaries by trying to formalize and expand my obligations even further. I pulled out my phone and texted Tom that I needed to see him tonight. He responded immediately saying he'd bring dinner. When he arrived at my apartment 2 hours later, I was still sitting at the kitchen table staring at the numbers I'd written down. 55 hours per week. Tom set down the takeout bags and came over to look at what I was doing. He read through my calculations silently while I sat there feeling numb. Then he pulled out the chair next to me and sat down. He didn't try to fix anything or tell me what to do. He just reached over and took my hand. That's when I started crying. Not quiet tears, but the kind of crying where you can't catch your breath. Tom pulled me into his arms and held me while I sobbed into his shirt. I kept saying I couldn't believe I'd let this happen, that I'd been so stupid not to see what Laura was doing. Tom just rubbed my back and said I wasn't stupid. I was kind, and Laura had taken advantage of that. We sat there on my kitchen floor for a long time while I cried out 2 years of exhaustion and resentment. Tom ordered me to take a shower while he heated up the food. By the time I came back out, he had plates set up and was scrolling through his phone. He showed me an article about family exploitation and parentification. Everything in it described exactly what Laura had been doing to me. Tom stayed until almost midnight, and when he left, he made me promise to talk to Julian about what was happening. I promised even though the idea made me want to throw up. Friday afternoon, Julian called me into his office right after my last patient left. His expression was serious as he gestured for me to close the door and sit down. He said he needed to talk to me about my recent performance. 3 patients had submitted complaints about rushed appointments in the past 2 weeks. I'd also had to reschedule 7 different sessions because of Laura's schedule demands. Julian pulled out a folder with the complaint forms, and I felt my face get hot as I read through them. One patient said I seemed distracted and didn't listen to her concerns about her knee pain. Another said I'd cut his session short by 15 minutes without explanation. The third said I'd been checking my phone repeatedly during their appointment. I remembered that day because Laura had been texting me about an emergency pickup that turned out to be nothing. Julian asked what was going on, and I told him everything. About Laura's schedule and the backup parent designation, and how I'd been trying to prove a point by following her demands exactly. Julian listened without interrupting, his expression getting more concerned as I talked. When I finished, he was quiet for a minute. Then he said very gently that my family situation could not continue to impact patient care. He understood I was in a difficult position, but my professional reputation was at stake. The clinic's reputation too, since patients were starting to complain. Julian suggested I take a few days off to sort things out. He said it wasn't a punishment, but he was worried about me and thought I needed space to handle this situation with Laura. I felt relief and failure at the same time. Relief because I was so tired I could barely think straight. Failure because I'd let my personal life mess up my job. Julian said he'd cover my appointments for Monday and Tuesday, and I should use that time to set some boundaries. I thanked him and left his office feeling like I might cry again. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could drive home. When I got to my apartment, I called my mom. She answered on the 3rd ring, sounding cheerful. I asked if she had time to talk, and her tone changed immediately. She asked what was wrong, and I started explaining everything that had been happening with Laura. The backup parent comments and the printed schedule and Laura banning me from dating. Mom was quiet while I talked. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end. Finally, she said she'd noticed Laura taking advantage but hadn't wanted to interfere between her daughters. I felt anger flash through me. I asked why she hadn't said anything if she'd noticed. Mom sighed and said she thought I would speak up if it bothered me, and Laura had been under so much stress as a single mom that she didn't want to make things harder. Mom said Laura had always struggled with asking for help directly. Even as a kid, she would manipulate situations until people volunteered instead of just asking. She'd create problems or act helpless until someone stepped in to fix things. Mom said the promotion had probably made Laura feel more out of control because suddenly everyone was watching her performance at work. So she was trying to control me instead of admitting she was overwhelmed and needed actual help. Mom asked what I was going to do, and I said I didn't know. She offered to talk to Laura, but I said no. This was between me and my sister, and I needed to handle it myself. Mom made me promise to call her if things got worse. I promised and hung up feeling slightly better, but also more confused. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Saturday and Sunday, I barely left my apartment. Tom came over Saturday afternoon and we watched movies. Sunday, I cleaned my entire place and tried not to think about Laura or the kids. Then Sunday night, my phone rang. Laura. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Laura was crying before she even said hello. She said the kids were asking why I didn't love them anymore and why I was being so mean to Mommy. She said the 6-year-old had cried himself to sleep asking when Auntie was coming back. I felt the familiar guilt rising up like a wave. that automatic response that made me want to apologize and fix everything. But I pushed it down because I knew what Laura was doing. She was manipulating me through the kids just like she'd been doing for weeks. I told Laura very calmly that I loved the kids completely, but I was not their parent. She needed to stop telling them I was choosing Tom over them, because that wasn't true, and it wasn't fair to them. Laura started to argue, her voice getting louder. She said I was abandoning them and breaking my commitment to the family. I hung up. My hands were shaking so hard I had to put the phone down on the table. Laura called back immediately, but I didn't answer. She called 3 more times and sent a string of texts saying I was being cruel and selfish. I turned off my phone and went to bed even though it was only 8:30. Monday morning, I turned my phone back on and saw 12 missed calls from Laura and 1 from the school. I called the school first. The secretary said the 6-year-old had asked to see me during drop-off and had gotten upset when Laura said I wasn't coming. They wanted to make sure everything was okay with the family. I said everything was fine and I'd talk to my nephew. When I got to Laura's house to do the morning pickup that the schedule required, the kids were already dressed and eating breakfast. Laura wasn't there. The 6-year-old looked at me with big sad eyes and asked why I was being different now. He asked why I didn't play with them like I used to. I knelt down next to his chair and took his hand. I told him I loved him very much and I always would. But I had my own life too, and that didn't mean I loved him any less. I tried to explain that grown-ups need time for their own things, and that was okay and normal. The 4-year-old interrupted to say that Mommy told her I was going away soon because I had a boyfriend now. My chest felt tight as I looked at her little face. Laura was actively poisoning my relationship with the kids to maintain control over me. She was using them as weapons, and they didn't even know it. I told both kids that I wasn't going anywhere, and I would always be their aunt. But things might look a little different from before, and that was okay. The 6-year-old asked if I still loved Mommy, and I said yes, even though I wasn't sure that was true anymore. I drove them to the school and daycare, my mind spinning. Laura had crossed a line by telling the kids those things. She was hurting them to hurt me. That evening after I picked the kids up and brought them back to Laura's house, I waited until they were in the other room watching TV. Then I pulled out my phone and texted Laura. I said we needed to have a serious conversation without the kids present. I said we needed to talk about boundaries and expectations and what was actually reasonable. Laura responded 10 minutes later. She said she was too busy with work and her actual responsibilities as a parent. The implication was crystal clear. I wasn't a real parent, so my concerns didn't matter. I stared at that text for a long time before I put my phone away. Tuesday afternoon, I was between patients when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost sent it to voicemail, but something made me answer. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Fiona, Laura's boss at the accounting firm, and my stomach dropped because bosses don't call family members unless something is really wrong. She apologized immediately for overstepping boundaries, but said she was concerned about Laura and hoped I could help clarify some things. I gripped my phone tighter and asked what was going on. Fiona explained that Laura had been struggling at work lately, missing deadlines she'd never missed before, seeming distracted during meetings and making unusual errors in client files. She'd pulled Laura aside yesterday to check in, and Laura had mentioned family issues. Something about childcare arrangements falling through. My face got hot because I knew exactly what Laura had told her. Fiona asked very carefully if everything was okay with our arrangement, if I was still able to help with the kids, because Laura had implied I might be backing out. I sat down hard in my office chair, stunned that Laura was discussing this at work, potentially making herself look unreliable to her boss. I took a breath and told Fiona there had been a misunderstanding about expectations, and Laura and I were working through it. I kept my voice diplomatic even though I wanted to scream about Laura manipulating the situation to make me look like the problem. Fiona sounded relieved and said she was glad we were communicating, then added that Laura seemed to be under tremendous pressure and maybe needed more support than she was willing to admit. She gave me her husband's contact information, said his name was Rory, and he was a family therapist who specialized in exactly these kinds of situations. I thanked her and saved the number even though I wasn't sure I'd use it. That night I couldn't sleep, my brain replaying every interaction with Laura from the past 2 years like a movie I couldn't turn off. I stared at my ceiling, remembering the exact moment the backup parent language started, and suddenly it clicked into place like a puzzle piece I'd been ignoring. It was right after a family gathering where Brett's brother Axel had asked about the kids, asked how Laura was managing everything alone, and Laura had gotten this tight look on her face. She'd launched into this whole speech about how she wasn't alone, how she had a great support system, how she was handling single motherhood just fine. The next week she'd started calling me backup parent instead of just saying I helped out. I rolled over and grabbed my phone, scrolling back through old texts, and found the pattern I'd missed while living through it. Every time someone questioned her parenting or implied she needed help, Laura's control over me got tighter. When her coworker mentioned daycare options, Laura added morning duties to my schedule. When Mom suggested a cleaning service, Laura started having me come over on weekends to help with housework. The promotion had given her financial security, but also more eyes on her, more people watching. More chances for someone to notice she was struggling. She couldn't control whether people judged her, but she could control me. Could make it look like she had everything perfectly managed by turning me into her shadow parent. Thursday morning, I called Rory's number before I could talk myself out of it. He answered on the second ring, and I explained who I was and how I got his contact information. He suggested we meet that afternoon during my lunch break at a coffee shop near my clinic. I showed up 10 minutes early and ordered tea I didn't drink, my hands shaking around the paper cup. Rory arrived exactly on time. A calm-looking man in his 40s who sat down across from me and just waited for me to start talking. I told him everything. The whole story from Brett leaving to the printed schedule to Laura banning me from dating. He listened without interrupting, just nodding occasionally and taking notes on a small pad. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment before confirming what I'd already started to suspect. Laura was exhibiting controlling behavior rooted in deep insecurity and fear of judgment as a single mother. He explained it carefully, said that Laura likely saw me as an extension of herself, rather than a separate person, which was why she felt entitled to dictate my dating life and schedule. She wasn't trying to hurt me exactly. She was trying to control her own anxiety by controlling me, turning me into a tool she could use to manage her fear of being seen as inadequate. Every time someone questioned her parenting, she tightened her grip on me to prove she had everything under control. Rory leaned forward and said, family therapy could help, but Laura had to recognize the problem first. He warned me that people in her mindset often resist help, because admitting they need it feels like admitting failure as a parent, and for Laura, that fear of failure was driving everything. He asked if I thought Laura would be willing to sit down with a mediator, and I honestly didn't know. I thanked him for his time and drove back to work with his words circling in my head. This new framework for understanding 2 years of my life. Friday evening, I was making dinner when someone knocked on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole and saw Laura standing there with all 3 kids and 2 suitcases, and my heart started racing before I even opened the door. Laura pushed past me the second I turned the knob, herding the kids inside and thrusting an overnight bag into my hands. She said she'd been called for an emergency work trip and needed me to keep them for the weekend, her words coming out fast and clipped like she was reading from a script she'd practiced. I looked at the kids standing in my entryway looking confused and tired, then at Laura who wouldn't quite meet my eyes. I walked over to my fridge where the printed schedule was still taped up, yellowing slightly at the edges from 2 weeks of cooking steam. I pointed at it and told Laura very calmly that weekend childcare wasn't on the schedule I signed. Laura's face went red immediately, that angry flush I'd seen 100 times before. She started yelling that I was being ridiculous. This was an emergency. Family helps family when emergencies happen. Her voice got louder with each word, and the 6-year-old started crying. I kept my voice level and asked what the emergency was exactly. Laura sputtered that it was a work crisis, a client situation that required immediate attention. I asked why she couldn't have called me first, given me any warning instead of just showing up with packed bags. She said there wasn't time and I was making this so much harder than it needed to be. I pulled the printed schedule off my fridge and held it up so Laura could see the yellowing paper with her own handwriting. Family doesn't treat family like unpaid employees, I said, keeping my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. I won't be manipulated anymore. Laura's face went from red to almost purple, and she grabbed her phone from her purse. She stabbed at the screen while yelling that I was selfish, that I was abandoning her children, that I'd promised to help, and now I was backing out when she needed me most. The kids were still standing in my entryway looking confused and scared, the 6-year-old crying again. Laura put the phone to her ear, and I heard it ring twice before someone picked up. Mom, Laura said in this broken, sobbing voice that didn't match how angry she'd been 2 seconds before. She won't take the kids. She's refusing to help, and I have this work emergency, and she just doesn't care that I'm going to lose my job. I watched Laura pace my tiny kitchen while she cried into the phone, telling our mother that I'd changed, that I was choosing some man over my own family, that she didn't know what she was going to do. She hung up and looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, something between rage and actual fear. You're going to regret this, she said quietly. Then she herded the kids back out my door without another word. I stood there staring at the closed door for probably 5 minutes before my phone started ringing. Mom's name lit up my screen and I almost didn't answer because I knew what was coming. I picked up and immediately heard Laura sobbing in the background, that same broken sound she'd used on the phone before. Honey, what's going on? Mom said, and her voice had that careful tone she used when she was trying not to take sides. I sat down on my couch and started explaining everything from the beginning. The 2 years of helping, the promotion that changed Laura, the backup parent comments, the printed schedule with 42 hours of childcare demands. I told her about Laura banning me from dating, about going through my phone, about telling the kids I was choosing Tom over them. Mom was quiet while I talked, and I could still hear Laura crying, but it sounded further away now. I explained about the schedule I'd signed and how I'd been following it exactly to show Laura how impossible her demands were. When I finished, there was this long silence where nobody said anything, and Laura's crying had stopped completely. Is that true? Mom said. but she wasn't talking to me anymore. Laura, is what she's saying true? I heard Laura's voice but couldn't make out the words, just the defensive tone that meant she was trying to justify everything. Mom's voice changed then, went from careful to disappointed in a way I recognized from when we were kids, and one of us had really messed up. Laura Marie, we need to talk about this privately, Mom said. You and I need to have a very serious conversation about what's appropriate to ask of your sister. The line went quiet, and I realized Mom had hung up without saying goodbye to me. I sat on my couch holding my phone and feeling like I might throw up. The 6-year-old's face kept replaying in my head, the confusion and hurt when Laura dragged them out of my apartment. They didn't understand what was happening, and that wasn't their fault. An hour passed and I'd moved from the couch to my bed, still fully dressed and staring at the ceiling. My phone rang again and it was Mom calling back. I've got the kids for the weekend, she said without any greeting. They're watching a movie in the living room right now. Her voice sounded tired in a way I'd never heard before. You and Laura need to sit down with someone who can help you both communicate better. Someone neutral. I told her that sounded good and waited for whatever else she was going to say. I need to tell you something and I need you to just listen, Mom continued. I've been enabling your sister's behavior by always stepping in to smooth things over. Every time she's asked too much of you, I've told you that family helps family and Laura's had such a hard time. I made excuses for her instead of telling her she was being unreasonable. That stops now. I felt something loosen in my chest that I didn't know had been tight. Mom said she loved us both, but what Laura was doing wasn't okay, and I had every right to have my own life. We talked for another 20 minutes about logistics and boundaries and how this mediation thing might work. When we hung up, I finally got up and changed into pajamas, even though it was only 7 in the evening. Tuesday morning, I woke up to a text from Laura that was so long I had to scroll to read the whole thing. She'd sent it at 3 in the morning, which meant she'd been up all night writing it. The message said I'd humiliated her in front of Mom, and now Mom was treating her like a bad parent. It said I'd also humiliated her in front of her boss, Fiona, because apparently Fiona had asked if everything was okay with childcare arrangements, and Laura had to admit there were family issues. The text went on to say that if I didn't want to help anymore, I should just say so, instead of playing games with the schedule and making her look incompetent. She wrote that she'd always been there for me when I needed her, and this was how I repaid her support. The last line said she guessed she knew where she stood now, and she'd figure things out on her own like she always did. I read the whole thing twice and then started typing my response. I wrote out everything I'd been thinking for weeks but hadn't been able to say. I told Laura that I'd been helping 42 hours per week for 2 years, that I'd calculated the actual time and it was equivalent to a full-time job on top of my real job. I explained that I loved her kids completely, but I wasn't their parent, and she needed to stop introducing me that way. I wrote about how her attempt to control my dating life had crossed a line I couldn't uncross, how telling the kids I was choosing Tom over them was manipulation. I said I understood she was scared and overwhelmed as a single mom, but that didn't give her the right to treat me like an employee she could schedule and control. I told her I was willing to help on a reasonable schedule that respected both our lives and our boundaries. I would not sign any more agreements, and I would not accept being called backup parent ever again. The last part was hardest to write, but I made myself type it out. She needed to decide if she wanted my help as family who supported each other, or if she wanted to find alternative childcare. I read it 3 times before hitting send. My second message was shorter. I'm willing to help 2 days a week with pickups and 1 weekend afternoon, I wrote. That's what I can do while still having my own life. You need to hire someone for the rest of the coverage because that's the responsible thing to do as a parent. I'll always love the kids and I'll always be their aunt, but I can't be their second parent. That's not fair to any of us. I hit send and then turned my phone face down on the kitchen counter. 3 days went by with no response from Laura. Not a text, not a call, nothing. The silence felt like this weird combination of relief and terror, like waiting for test results you're not sure you want to know. Wednesday night, Tom picked me up for dinner at this Italian place downtown that he'd been wanting to try. I barely tasted anything even though the pasta was supposed to be amazing. My mind kept spinning through possible outcomes. Maybe Laura would agree to reasonable boundaries and we could rebuild something healthier. Maybe she'd cut me off completely and I'd lose my relationship with the kids. Maybe she'd show up at my apartment again with more demands. Tom reached across the table and took my hand, told me to try to be present for at least 5 minutes. I managed to focus on him and the restaurant and the normal conversation we were having, but the anxiety was still there underneath everything. Thursday afternoon, my phone rang while I was between patients and Laura's name appeared on the screen. My stomach dropped, but I answered. Her voice sounded completely different from the last time we'd talked, tired and small instead of angry. Can we meet at Mom's house on Saturday? She asked, with Rory there as a mediator. Mom already talked to him and he said he'd do it. I said yes immediately, maybe too quickly, but I wanted this conversation to happen before I could lose my nerve. Laura thanked me in this quiet voice and then hung up. I stood in the clinic hallway holding my phone and feeling like maybe something might actually change. Kira found me there a few minutes later and I told her about the mediation. She hugged me right there in the hallway and said she was proud of me for holding my boundaries. The rest of Thursday and all of Friday passed in this strange slow motion where I couldn't focus on anything except Saturday morning. Saturday morning arrived and I was up at 6 even though the mediation wasn't until 10. I changed clothes 3 times and couldn't eat breakfast. Tom came over at 9:30 and found me pacing my apartment in jeans and my 4th shirt choice. He told me I looked fine and we needed to leave or I'd be late. In the car, I couldn't stop fidgeting with my seatbelt and running through everything I wanted to say. Tom pulled into Mom's driveway and put the car in the park, then turned to look at me. "You didn't create this situation," he said. "You just refused to keep enabling it. That's not the same as causing it." I nodded and took a deep breath. He squeezed my hand, and I got out of the car before I could change my mind. Mom's front door was already open, and I could see Laura's car parked on the street. And I walked up the steps feeling like I was heading into something that would change everything, for better or worse. Mom's living room felt smaller than I remembered. Laura sat on the couch across from me, her hands twisting in her lap, and Rory sat in the armchair between us with a yellow legal pad. Mom stood near the kitchen doorway like she couldn't decide if she should sit or stay ready to escape. Rory started by asking us each to describe the situation from our perspective without interrupting each other. Laura went first, and her voice came out defensive and shaky at the same time. She talked about how hard everything was as a single mom, how she couldn't do it alone, how I'd always been there, and she thought that meant I always would be. She said the schedule was just trying to organize what we were already doing, that she didn't understand why I was suddenly making everything so difficult. I watched her face while she talked, and saw the tears building up, saw her jaw set in that stubborn way she'd had since we were kids. When it was my turn, I pulled out my phone and showed Rory the schedule Laura had printed. He studied it for a long minute, then asked me to walk through a typical week. I started with Monday morning at 6, the pickup times, the evening duties, the weekend coverage, the overnight stays. I kept my voice steady and factual, just listing what the schedule required hour by hour. Rory wrote numbers on his legal pad while I talked. When I finished, he looked up at Laura and asked if this was accurate. She nodded but said I was making it sound worse than it was. That family helps each other. Rory asked how many hours per week the schedule required from me. Laura opened her mouth but nothing came out. Rory turned his pad around so we could both see the calculation written there in neat columns. 42 hours per week of childcare. Laura stared at the number like she'd never seen it before. Rory asked her gently if she realized she'd been asking me to work a full-time job on top of my actual full-time job. Laura's face changed then, the defensiveness cracking into something that looked like shock. She said she never added it up like that. She just knew she needed help with morning and evening and weekends. Rory nodded and asked what would happen if she hired someone to provide 42 hours of childcare per week. Laura whispered that it would cost more than her mortgage payment. The room went quiet except for the kitchen clock ticking. Then Laura started crying for real. Not the angry defensive tears from before, but these horrible broken sobs that shook her whole body. She said she was so scared all the time. Scared of failing. Scared of people judging her. Scared that Brett leaving proved she wasn't good enough to be anyone's partner or parent. She said when I agreed to help after Brett left, it felt like maybe she wasn't completely alone. Like maybe if I was committed as backup parent, then she had someone and wasn't just a failure doing it all by herself. The words came out messy and desperate between sobs. She said the promotion made everything worse because more people were watching her. More people could see if she messed up, and she needed me to be locked in so she wouldn't fall apart. I felt my own throat getting tight listening to her. I understood the fear, I really did, but understanding it didn't make what she'd done okay. I waited until her crying slowed down. Then I said, I got why she was scared, but I couldn't sacrifice my whole life to manage her worry. I told her I loved her, and I loved the kids completely, but I needed boundaries, and she needed to accept that asking for help wasn't the same as failing as a parent. Laura wiped her face and said she knew she'd gone too far, that somewhere along the way helping had turned into expecting, and she couldn't see it until Rory wrote that number on the pad. Rory asked what would feel reasonable for both of us going forward. I said I could do pickups 2 days a week and 1 weekend afternoon, maybe 4 or 5 hours total. Laura looked panicked and asked what about the rest of the time. Rory suggested she hire a part-time nanny for the other coverage, said it was the responsible thing to do and didn't mean she was failing. Laura argued that hiring help felt like admitting defeat. Mom finally spoke up from the doorway and said that was ridiculous, that every parent needs support and paying for good childcare was smart. Parenting, not weakness. We spent the next hour working out details with Rory guiding the conversation. Laura agreed to stop introducing me as backup parent and to respect that I had my own life, including dating. She'd hire a nanny for the coverage I couldn't provide. I'd help 2 weekday afternoons and 1 weekend afternoon, but anything beyond that required advance notice and my actual agreement. Laura looked at me with red, swollen eyes and said she was sorry for manipulating the kids, for telling them I was choosing Tom over them. She admitted she'd been jealous that I might have the relationship she lost with Brett, and she'd taken that fear and anger out on me in a way that was completely unfair. Her voice broke on the last words. I reached across the space between us and took her hand. Mom came and sat on the arm of the couch next to Laura, putting her hand on Laura's shoulder. Mom said she should have stepped in earlier instead of letting things get this bad, that she'd watched Laura's behavior get worse and worse but didn't want to interfere between her daughters. She promised she'd be more present to help Laura work through the single-parent anxiety without dumping it all on me. Rory made us both agree to check in with him in 2 weeks to see how the new arrangement was working. Laura signed a paper acknowledging the boundaries we'd set, and I signed one agreeing to my specific commitment. It felt weird and formal, but also necessary after everything that had happened. When we left Mom's house, 3 hours had passed and I felt completely drained. Tom was waiting in his car and he took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug without asking questions. The following week felt strange in a way I couldn't quite name. Wednesday afternoon, I picked up the kids from the school like we'd agreed and took them to the park. The 6-year-old ran straight to the swings shouting for me to push him. The 4-year-old wanted to play tag. The 2-year-old toddled after a dog with his arms out. I wasn't checking my phone every 5 minutes or watching the clock worried about what came next. I actually played with them, laughed at their jokes, helped them climb the jungle gym without feeling that crushing weight of resentment. When I dropped them back at Laura's house at 5:30, the 6-year-old hugged me and said this was more fun than before. I asked what he meant, and he said I wasn't grumpy anymore. His honesty stung, but he was right. The rigid schedule had turned me into someone stressed and resentful, and the kids had felt it even if they couldn't name it. Laura started seeing Rory individually the next week for therapy about her control issues and single-parent fears. She texted me after her first session saying thank you for forcing this, that she hadn't realized how much terror was driving everything she did. She said Rory was helping her see that asking for help directly was actually stronger than manipulating people into giving it. 2 weeks after the mediation, Tom and I had dinner at Laura's house with her and the kids. Laura had ordered pizza and set up the dining room table with actual plates instead of paper. It was awkward at first with everyone being extra polite and careful. But then the 6-year-old spilled juice all over himself and we all laughed, and Laura asked Tom about his work at the fire station. He told stories about rescue calls that had the kids fascinated, and Laura smiled and didn't make a single comment about my dating life taking away from family time. When we left that night, Laura hugged me at the door and whispered that she liked him, that she could see why I wanted to spend time with him. Monday morning, I walked into the clinic and Julian called me into his office. I thought maybe I was in trouble, but he said he'd noticed a big change in my work over the past 2 weeks. My patient appointments were running on time, I wasn't scattered and exhausted, and 2 patients had specifically mentioned how much more present I seemed during their sessions. He said whatever I'd done to sort out my family situation was clearly working, because I was back to being the therapist he'd hired 2 years ago. A month passed after the mediation session at Mom's house. Laura called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was between patients. She said she'd hired someone to help with the kids and wanted me to meet her. The woman's name was Siobhan Pace, and she'd been working as a nanny for 6 years with excellent references. Laura's voice sounded different on the phone, lighter somehow, like she'd been carrying something heavy and finally put it down. I drove to Laura's house that Saturday morning and found a woman in her early 30s playing board games with all 3 kids in the living room. Siobhan had dark curly hair and laugh lines around her eyes, and the kids were completely focused on the game instead of fighting or demanding attention. Laura pulled me into the kitchen and admitted she'd been scared to hire help because it felt like failing as a mom. She said Rory had helped her see that asking for professional childcare wasn't admitting defeat. It was being responsible about what she could actually handle. The relief on Laura's face was obvious, and I hugged her without saying anything, because words would have made it awkward. Siobhan came 3 afternoons a week and every other Saturday, giving Laura actual breathing room in her schedule. The kids adapted fast because Siobhan knew how to make cleanup time into a game, and never seemed tired or frustrated with their constant questions. I picked up the kids one Wednesday afternoon a few weeks later for our scheduled park time. The 6-year-old ran straight to me when I arrived and wrapped his arms around my legs. We walked to the playground near Laura's house, and I pushed him on the swings while the 4-year-old played in the sandbox. He asked if we could get ice cream after, and I said yes because the schedule wasn't controlling every minute anymore. We sat on a bench eating our cones, and he looked at me with chocolate ice cream on his nose. He said he liked having special aunt time now instead of everyday time. I asked him why, and he said because I wasn't tired and grumpy anymore when we hung out. His words stung even though his voice was completely matter-of-fact, just stating something he'd noticed. I wiped the ice cream off his face and told him I liked special time better too. He smiled and went back to his cone, and I realized he was right. When I'd been following that rigid schedule, I'd been resentful and exhausted, and the kids had felt it even if they couldn't name it. Now when I spent time with them, I actually wanted to be there, and they could tell the difference. 3 months after the mediation, my relationship with Laura had changed into something I didn't quite recognize yet. We weren't as close as we'd been before everything exploded. There was still tension sometimes when she made requests that felt too much like the old pattern. But we had clear boundaries now, and we both respected them most of the time. Laura didn't call me backup parent anymore, and she'd stopped introducing me as her childcare solution. When we had family dinners, the conversation felt careful in a way it never used to, like we were both watching for old habits trying to creep back in. Mom came over more often to help with the kids, and Laura had started actually accepting that help instead of pretending she had everything under control. The kids seemed happier overall, with more adults sharing the load and less pressure on any single person. It wasn't the easy closeness Laura and I used to have, but it felt more honest somehow, built on reality instead of unstated expectations and growing resentment. Tom and I started planning a weekend trip to the coast for next month. We were looking at hotels online one evening at my apartment when I realized I should probably tell Laura since it fell on one of my usual kid days. I texted her about the dates and asked if she could adjust the schedule. She responded within minutes saying to have fun and she'd work it out with Siobhan. No guilt trip, no comment about me prioritizing my relationship over family. Just a simple acknowledgement that I had my own life. I showed Tom the text and he smiled and said it was progress. It was such a small moment, Laura's casual response about a weekend away, but it represented everything I'd fought for over the past few months. The right to have my own life and my own plans while still being a loving aunt to my sister's kids. Not a backup parent, not a co-parent, just an aunt who helped when she could and lived her own life the rest of the time. That's how it went from my side. Now I want to hear your version. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading through later.